This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. The authority gap. Why women are still taken less seriously than men and what we can do about it. In this episode, I chat with political and economic journalist, broadcaster and author of the bestseller The Authority Gap, Mary Ann Sieghart. Her life experiences and 3 years of extensive research brought her to writing this book and taking on the subject of closing the gender authority gap. Mary Ann wants men to listen, so here we are. Let's hear from Mary Ann. Mary Ann Sieghart, a big welcome to the Win Happy podcast. How are you keeping?
Thank you so much. Delighted to be on, and I'm very well, thank you.
And for the listener, we're speaking to the author of the best-selling book, The Authority Gap, Why We Still Don't Take Women as Seriously as We Should, and what we can do about it.
Yes, there's plenty of food for thought there.
I think there's plenty of food for thought. And Mary Ann, the reason I wanted you on the podcast was I'm a big podcast listener, and I was listening to a particular episode of The Guardian, and I heard this woman talking about her new book, and I think you were talking to a female interviewer, and obviously all of the subject matter about women being taken more seriously, the authority gap. And at the very, very end of the conversation, it was a little bit of a challenge, and that you were more interested in men listening than women, because you felt it was a message that men needed to consume. So I was thinking, okay, let's see what this woman is made of. So I reached out, and fair play to you, you came back to me.
Yes, I mean, I really think it's important that men think about this subject as well as women, because the world won't change unless men change. We obviously need to change too. So, the bias against women is held in our own unconscious brains too. It's women as well as men. But if men don't take any notice of the problem, basically it won't be solved.
Absolutely. So I'm all yours, Mary Ann.
What would you like me to do? Tell you what the authority gap is and how we know it's there?
What I'd like to do first, if that's okay, is I'd like the listener to know where Mary Ann is coming from, to get some sense of her background and what brought her to writing this book, because obviously it didn't come out of the blue. So a question I ask all of my guests is, who the hell is Mary Ann and where did she come from?
Okay. Well, my father was a refugee from Vienna. He left Vienna at the age of 12 and came to England, and my mother is British. I guess that tells you a little bit about my heritage. I wanted to be a journalist from a very young age. From about the age of 12, I wanted to be a political columnist at the Times. And amazingly, that's what I ended up doing eventually. So I'm a very lucky woman. I've spent most of my life as a journalist. Yeah, quite a bit of effort too went into it, I have to say. So I went to Oxford and read PPE, which I know is a bit of a cliche, but it does set you up very well for the world of journalism and news and current affairs. I also think it's very useful as a woman to be able to understand economics, which is often thought to be a bit of a male domain. And certainly in newspapers, there was a real divide between journalists who understood economics and those who didn't. So I'm very grateful to have studied that, because I was always interested in writing about politics, economics, business, finance, those sorts of subjects, which are sort of male stereotyped. And I think I realized that unless I really fought to be included in the sort of male domain of newspapers, I never would be taken as seriously as them, because women quite often tend to get shoved off into what the men call the fluffy sides of the paper, features, fashion, beauty, cooking, travel, and then even on the news side, subjects like health and education are seen as a bit fluffy, compared with defense and the economy. So I thought, I've got to prove to these men that I can be as good as they are, so I have to do it in their domain. So for most of my life, I started off as a financial journalist, and then I became a political journalist, which is what I was really passionate about, and did that for about 30 years. But brewing in the background always was my frustration at how unequal the world still was for women. And along with some other senior women journalists, I helped to set up an organization called Women in Journalism, because there wasn't one for our industry. And that both supported women in the industry, but also did research on how women were portrayed in the media, which a lot of male journalists found quite uncomfortable, I think, and often didn't want to publish. Of course, the men called it whinge, women in journalism. So we were really we were up against it from the beginning. Now it's completely accepted. But in those days, it was quite unfashionable and felt to be, a slightly brave thing to admit you were doing. So I wrote a few columns that were about, I suppose, feminist issues, about the double standards that apply to women and men and that sort of thing. But it wasn't until, I guess, I had really proved myself in this male domain that I thought it was both safe and effective to write a whole book about it. Safe in the sense that I would be taken as seriously writing about this subject as I was writing about, say, politics or economics, and effective in the sense that I had at least half a chance of men actually reading the book. Because part of the problem, and you sort of alluded to it earlier, is that women on average will read books that are roughly 50-50 written by men and written by women. So we're pretty open-minded about it. We'll just read whatever's the best book on a subject. Whereas men on average will read books that are 80-20 written by men and by women. In other words, they're 4 times more likely to read a book by a man than a book by a woman. So I'm already handicapped, aren't I? That if men just don't read.
Yeah. Yeah.
And why
I
should
agree
that
with
be?
you there. And
Yeah.
But I listened to some of the conversations you had on some of the other podcasts, and it's a really great question and a fantastic observation, and I'm thinking about it. But yet then when I think about the female books that come under my radar, like if I walk into my Waterstones and I even have a glance at the shelves and the glance of the books that are in special offers, the female books predominantly, if you were to take like 100% of books written by females, you're going to get the Maeve Binchy and all of the lovey-dovey, soft kind of romantic things that men just won't read in a month of Sundays. And out the other side.
Okay, so let's just explore that, because I'm quite happy to read a thriller which has on its cover a man in silhouette holding a gun. Okay, so that book is very much aimed at men, isn't it? You can tell from the cover, this is a book that is aimed at men, but I'm still perfectly happy to read it. So why aren't men perfectly happy to read a book which is predominantly aimed at women?
I've no interest in reading a fluffy book. It just doesn't interest me. And in a funny way, Marianne, and I've been listening to this carefully, in exactly the same way that, we have a gathering, and at a particular point in time in the gathering, the men will end up peeling in one direction and the women will end up peeling in the other. And sometimes it's just the subject matter and the topics. 'Cause even in work, just by way of information, I work in a fairly female-dominated sector. I work in communications. Our team, there's 15 of us. There's 3 guys out of the 15. And I love my female team. They're absolutely wonderful and brilliant. The best people, I would say, hands down, that I work with are women. But there's times when the conversation kicks off and it's like, okay, we're out of here. That's the girl talk. And we'll talk about the soccer or the rugby or whatever at the weekend. And I think we just have our natural places and our natural ways. Now, back to your comment about the thriller. If the thriller was written by a woman, yeah, absolutely. Now, I probably wouldn't read thrillers anyway, but I'd be more interested than that than a lovey-dovey soft story, if you get my drift.
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, it's really interesting to disentangle this. Because what you see as fluffy may actually just be a really interesting, insightful novel about the human condition. And if you're prepared to read a novel, say by, I don't know, Jonathan Franzen or Philip Roth, which are also exploring emotions and how people get on with each other and why we lead the lives that we lead, you probably wouldn't call them fluffy. And yes, it's probably not much different from, say, a novel by Marion Keyes.
Oh, yeah, but if a guy wrote a soft novel in that way, with soft topics, I probably wouldn't read that either, because the subject matter is of no interest to me. Now, we work in marketing, and, in marketing, you have your target audience. And at the very, very beginning, when you're thinking about your product, we're all doing it. Who's your target audience? Is it male, female? What's the demographic? And everything from the title to the artwork and even the footnotes, the notes about the author and all that kind of stuff, they're all designed 100% to attract that target audience. So I wonder, in a way, is something that we're talking about, is this a function of marketing where we do view, we want to target the female audience here, the male audience here, and everything is geared around attracting that particular individual?
It is partly, but I think it's interesting that the words that you use to describe the female writing are sort of derogatory words. So soft, fluffy, it's as if men are thinking down when they think of women's things. Whereas I'm not thinking of derogatory words when I think about a thriller written by a man. I might think when I read the book, God, there's slightly too much on the technical specifications of a Glock rifle, but I don't see it as in any way inferior. And I think we're slightly getting to the nub of it here. That I think men somehow find it embarrassing and humiliating or emasculating to be seen to read that sort of book in a way that we don't feel to be seen to read a stereotypically male book.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, and I don't mean to use those words in a derogatory fashion at all. But I just have no interest in that soft kind of romantic book. I've no interest in it. The subject matter is of no interest to me whatsoever.
Okay. So if you're in marketing, are you interested in what makes people tick?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So most of these novels are actually about what makes people tick.
Oh, yeah, and they're constructed to attract a particular target audience, because you're not going to get everyone when you put something out there. And like in this time-poor world, you do have to think about your target audience. And we're making all of those decisions now quicker than what we've ever done. Do I buy a product? Do I click on a link for whatever online? And the optics around it are so important. Like, for example, as part of our process when we're marketing anything, it always begins with who's your target audience, what's your proposition, and what is it about your proposition that will attract them? And the next step every single time is capturing that. So in the case of a book, it will be the book cover, it will be the title, the photography that's used, it might even be down to font style. But you do all of the time have a target audience in mind.
Okay, so perhaps we can move on to non-fiction from fiction, because I can tell, because it's also true that men on average are much less likely to read a non-fiction book by a woman. And I don't think we can necessarily call them fluffy. So, yeah. I put a great deal of sort of effort and thought into making sure that the cover of my book was one that a man wouldn't feel embarrassed to be seen reading on the tube. That was how I put it to my publisher. And I wanted it to be sort of striking and confident looking, not to have any, absolutely not to have pink in it, not to have flowery fonts, all that sort of thing, because I wanted it to appeal as much to men as to women. But then I also thought, how sad that a man might feel embarrassed to be seen reading a book by a woman on the tube, because I can't see us women ever feeling embarrassed to be seen reading a book by a man. And that's pretty much what I'm writing about, is this difference between the two.
Yeah. Well, I think you were spot on with your approach to the presentation of the book and the cover and working that, because you were trying to create a product for a general audience that wasn't going to go male or go female one way or the other. I think that's very clever, and that's just marketing.
Absolutely. And I specifically asked the publisher to put quotes, as many quotes from men on the cover as from women, because I knew that men would feel that sort of male third-party endorsement would be more effective for them than if they saw that Philippa Perry or Emily Maitlis was recommending it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely correct. And I mentioned in the intro to the podcast that I'd heard you on the Guardian podcast. That's where I heard you. But I listened to two since. And one was the London School of Economics. And I think there was another leadership one. And on each occasion, you were with a female audience. And I was kind of disappointed to hear that or to listen to, because it was kind of missing the point a little bit, wasn't it? Because you actually want the male audience. And as I was listening to it, it's one thing to have all the females in the room nodding their head, kind of agreeing with everything, but you need the guys in the room to kind of listen to what you're saying. And some of the females, I think, definitely, if you want to affect any of this change at all. Yeah,
very much so. I haven't got statistics on what proportion of my readers are male. I'd love it to be 50%, but I've an awful feeling it probably isn't, which is a shame. Yeah. But I was very pleased that the Sunday Times gave it to a man to review, and he actually said, "I warmly recommend this book to other men," because that's what I need, really. We've all got to think about this problem, not just women. I saw a lovely tweet, Marianne. I was on your Twitter feed, and I think someone had purchased the book and they were sharing it with their husband on a drive somewhere, and she had more or less said that he had changed his viewpoint by the end of the drive. And I think that was a fairly powerful thing. And the more that we get, maybe we win people over one at a time, and eventually they might get there. So could you tell me about the book, the main points, Marianne? Okay. So the authority gap is a measure of how much more seriously we still take men than women. So we tend to assume that a man knows what he's talking about until he proves otherwise, whereas for a woman, it's all too often the other way around. And so as a result, we women tend to be underestimated. We tend to be patronized. We tend to have our authority and our expertise challenged a lot more than men do. We get interrupted and talked over in meetings. Quite often we find it hard to influence a meeting because we will make a point and nobody takes any notice. And then 10 minutes later, a man makes exactly the same point and it's treated like the second coming. So these are the sort of phenomena that we come across as a result of the authority gap. And the authority gap is the mother of all gender gaps, because actually, if we're not being taken as seriously as men, then we're not going to be hired as readily, we're not going to be promoted as fast, and we're not going to be paid as much. And also, it's going to affect our confidence, because every time you get treated like that, you say something and nobody takes any notice, or you start talking and a man just talks over you, or somebody underestimates your competence. All these things are going to dent your confidence in life. And so we end up as in a sort of accumulation of these effects. They accumulate, they roll up like compound interest over the course of a lifetime to create really quite a large gap in opportunity and achievement between women and men. So I wanted to investigate, first of all, to prove this gap exists. And I've got an enormous amount of evidence there. I've done about 3 years of research, and I can give you some examples of that. But then to look at why it might exist and what can we do about it, but also actually to prove that men can actually gain from narrowing the authority gap. And that might sound counterintuitive. You might think, well, surely gender equality is like a seesaw in which as one side rises, the other side necessarily falls. But actually, it's not like that at all. There have been an immense number of academic studies showing that in more gender equal countries and in more gender equal relationships where the couples share the chores and the childcare and everything pretty equally, not only are women happier and healthier, which you might expect, children are also happier and healthier, and they do better at school and they have fewer behavioral difficulties, but the men themselves are happier and healthier. So they are twice as likely to say they're satisfied with their life, half as likely to be depressed, much less likely to get divorced, and they tend to drink less, smoke less, take fewer drugs. get more sleep at night. And here's the complete clincher, they get more frequent and better sex. So guys, my recommendation is read this book and your life will be transformed.
No, Marianne, maybe you should put a different cover on the book. You get more guys, how to have more sex.
Exactly.
Make it very practical. I'm so interested in what you're saying. And for me, being in business, and being honest with you, when I hear a lot of what you're saying, I'm kind of like, and I've heard you on the podcast and the other ones, I'm shaking my head saying, no way, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. And I know you've got the proof and it absolutely does happen. And I suppose in the grand scheme of things, when we look at lovely Boris and when we look at the not so lovely Donald Trump, very, very quickly you can see the danger of men out of control. And I think that's getting worse and not better, by the way. But, so maybe that there's another level to all this. It's not a gender issue. It's a particular type of male, particular in leadership, that we seem to be moving towards now. Even if we were having a big conversation about men not being afraid to be fluffy and more human and more loving and caring, that might be a good thing. That if we started to maybe display and behave in a softer way and not go to that macho, chest out, power hungry idiot that seems to be very popular at the moment. And so I think we've a lot going on there. So back to my point a little bit, in that if I've got a talented woman in my team, I'm an idiot if I don't encourage her and allow her to flourish and allow the organization to get the benefit of everything she has to offer. That for me is total stupidity. And maybe, and I think you're telling me absolutely, that bias has me not even recognizing that person at times, possibly. The other thing I wanted to chat to you about, I have a whole list of things, by the way. This could be a very long conversation, Marianne. The parenting issue. And for me, as a father of 2 kids, I was separated when I was 28. Now I've been married again since. But when I hear the flag being waved about, equality in that way, and in your case, it's all about authority, I'd be waving a similar flag about parenting and your equal right to be a parent. Because I felt for big tranches of my life that was denied of me. And you were a second-class citizen when it came to being a parent. But out the other end, you had 100% had a big responsibility about earning income and providing and everything else. So I think we maybe need to look at the two of those in equal fashion. What do you think? we can be equal parents as well.
I really wish we could be equal parents, actually. I'm very much in favor of that. And certainly my husband and I have done that all the way through. He was absolutely, he shared everything. He did just as much raising of the kids as I did. In fact, if anything, slightly more, because I was working on a newspaper. I often had to work on Sundays for the Monday paper. And he'd be in sole charge of, first of all, a baby, and then a toddler and a baby. And then as they grew up to, strapping daughters. So I think that's really important. It's really important for men in order to be able to bond with their children. Really important for the children, I think, to have a strong relationship with their father. But it's also great for the mother, actually, if the father takes, if the mother and father, assuming it's a straight couple, see it as an absolutely joint venture, and that they're a team working together to raise their children. I think that's fantastic. And I think employers actually ought to be far more understanding of parents' needs rather than mothers' needs. And I think they just should appreciate that, when you are having children, whatever gender you are, you might need to take your foot off the pedal a bit at work. You might ask for slightly more allowances, a bit more flexibility, working from home more, working more flexible hours, whatever. And it's in employers' interest to accommodate that in order to get the best out of you and not to hold it against you and think that you're somehow not properly committed to your career.
There's a lot of pressure, I would think, just observing at the moment some of my colleagues and everything. I think there's a ferocious amount of pressure on women now, because maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was the norm when the children came along that you may just take a step back from a career point of view and everything. And that was kind of the way a lot of that kind of thing went at the time. But now I think there's a big pressure on you not to drop any ball. And you have to be fully charged, and you need to return to the workplace exactly the same person as you were before, with no chat. And people are nearly looking out for it. You know, Mariana was back. She's had her second child. So will there be a drop-off? Will she be the same top performer that she was before? And if that workload isn't being, or that parent load isn't being shared equally with the husband, that's ferocious pressure on you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that a lot of fathers during these various lockdowns have come to realize quite how much work it takes to raise small children in particular, and are more prepared to share that work equally, because it does make an enormous difference to a woman. Well, to all three, actually, or four in the family. It makes a huge difference. As I said, everyone's happier as a result, including the man.
Are you seeing a change in those roles down the generations, Marianne?
Yeah, I do think that millennials are keener to share child rearing more equally, which is fantastic. And it's really great to see these younger fathers actively wanting to do it. So we've now got to make sure that employers allow them to do it, because that's the critical thing now is, what the pandemic has shown us is that it is possible to work flexibly, and in lots of jobs possible to work away from the workplace just as productively, if not more so. And so I think it's really important that employers allow people to carry on doing that as much as they can, and then not to penalise, crucially, not to penalise the people who do, because the danger is that it'll be more mothers who ask to work from home, and it's going to be more the guys who go into the office and schmooze their bosses and all that sort of thing and get rewarded as a result. So I think it's really important that organisations keep an eye on that and make sure that they are giving as many promotion opportunities to the women who aren't always in, or maybe not at all in the office, as to the men who are.
And behind the organisations, Marianne, is there a responsibility on how we structure all of this from a society point of view, and things like maternity benefit, that maybe the career disruption is balanced equally between the man and the woman, so that maternity leave is absolutely balanced? You know, the Scandinavian model, the countries there, where I think it's pretty much 50-50.
Yeah, that works really well, but it only works really well if the man has to use the half amount of leave and can't just transfer it to the woman. If he can just transfer it to the mother, then more often than not, in fact, hugely more often than not, he does. And he carries on working full time, and she just takes much longer leave. And as a result, employers then discriminate more against women of childbearing age, because they think, oh, she's going to take a whole year off. Whereas if they knew that either a man or a woman of childbearing age was just as likely to take 6 months off or 3 months off or whatever, they wouldn't be discriminating against women so much. So, yeah, I think you need what's called a use it or lose it parental leave for fathers. And crucially, it's got to be reasonably well paid. That makes an enormous difference, because if they're only on very low pay, quite often, the family doesn't get supported.
Yeah. If anyone needs to step off their career or just take a little step back for a short period because we brought little loved ones into the world, if it's fair between both sexes, well, then you're constructing a different society, and all of those stereotypes and everything else start to disappear.
Absolutely, yeah. But crucially, the fathers really enjoy it. So fathers who do take this parental leave get quite evangelical about it. So I think you're not doing it just altruistically. You can do it for yourselves, and then everybody benefits.
I remember a conversation that was had in work just after my second child was born, and she was induced a day before she was scheduled to. And like that, I had to mind my other kid. I had to mind Brendan when that happened. And I remember coming into work, and obviously we're going back to a previous time, but I remember popping into work just to check my emails. I presume there were emails at that time. And one of the other guys came in and said, "You're in big trouble." And I, "What are you talking about?" "Well, I heard you had the baby yesterday, so you could have made the meeting today." And I had to mind my son. I was senior enough in the company. I remember having a huge row with my boss, and I more or less said, "Listen, I put this place first all of the time. And on this particular occasion, you can get stuffed." I've got responsibilities. And I made sure I'd all of my work done well in advance, so when the baby was born that it could take a little bit of time. But I remember being at a meeting and my boss drew a picture. He said, "Oh, I'm going to draw a picture of Greg." And he sketched it out on a pad and he drew a thumb over my head. Just to say, "Oh, Greg is under the thumb." That was the whole idea of it. So I think there's different forces here that are all contributing to the authority gap. And in some ways, it's forcing males to be a particular way. And that's been programmed into us to such a degree that it'll take a long time, I think, for it to be deprogrammed, if you get my argument or my idea.
Yeah, I completely do. But I think men have got as much to gain from reducing these incredibly old-fashioned traditional stereotypes as we have. I mean, I think a lot of men don't fit into that sort of stereotype of the sort of, butch, macho, aggressive, sports-loving bloke and would love not to have to. So, or indeed, not to be allowed to show their feelings, not to admit vulnerability. We put men in a straitjacket too. And it's not nice for men. It's not nice for women. Let's just treat everybody like the individual they are. That's all I'm asking for, really.
Yeah. I think the world would be a better place, Marianne.
So do I.
You spoke as well about social media and who people follow and who they don't follow in your book.
Yeah, I've got a whole chapter. By the way, I want to say this really isn't a man-bashing book. I've also got a chapter on how women are biased against other women too. But I do have a chapter on something which is a particularly male phenomenon, which is some men, at least, just not listening to us in the first place. And I mean that metaphorically as well as literally, though it does sometimes happen literally. So not, as we talked about earlier, not reading the books that we write, not following us on social media, not watching films about women, though they're perfectly happy to watch films about men, that sort of thing. So they're basically narrowing their field of vision by half. And if they're not reading our books or if they're not following us on Twitter or whatever, it's not just that they're not according us as much authority. They're not even listening to us in the first place. So how can they tell whether what we say has any authority? So, for instance, there was a survey done of the 2017 general election in the UK, and it was to assess how influential each political journalist was during the course of that campaign. And so to measure that, they looked at how often these journalists' tweets were, well, first of all, how often they were followed, and then how much their tweets were retweeted and commented on and that sort of thing, which is the currency of Twitter. And given that the most influential political journalist, who's the BBC's political editor, is female, Laura Kuenssberg, how many women do you reckon made it into that top 10? Well, I can tell you it was a big fat zero. So not even Laura Kuenssberg made it into the top 10 most politically influential journalists. And so the data analysts who did this study thought, well, that's a bit weird. So they did a bit of a deeper dive. And what they discovered was that the male followers, the people on Twitter who were deciding whether to retweet or comment on these tweets, were 5 times more likely to follow and retweet male political journalists than female political journalists. So they're not even allowing these women into their newsfeed, even though the women might be tweeting really interesting facts or really interesting links. They're not even allowing them into their newsfeed. And what does that tell us? I mean, these guys are just closing their minds, I think.
Yeah, you're just missing out on important information. We do a lot of training on social media. And when it comes to Twitter, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Now, again, this is a generalization, but a typical thing between the male Twitter account and the female Twitter account. A lot of the times you'll see the guy in his 160 character description of himself saying, Greg, partner at Fusion, follower of LFC, podcaster, win happy. And you'll have the girl saying, yeah, Mary, mother of 2 gorgeous children, married to Jack, and something. And it's kind of funny how we present ourselves. And I think, why does the guy always go to the football team? And the girl will often, and if you do a quick straw poll of different people you'll follow, a lot of the time they'll mention their kids and their husband. And in a way, we're just different. Now, That's a different argument, I know, to the one that you're making about who we follow and who we retweet and all that kind of thing. But I think at such a basic level, we do present ourselves as being quite different characters. We're driven different from an emotional point of view, even down to how we decide to brand ourselves with our 160 characters.
But it's also how we are seen by other people, isn't it? So I don't put mum of two or wife of Di or anything on my bio. It's strictly professional. But I do remember I once wrote an article in the Times about how it was sort of quite amusing feature, but rather Kafkaesque, about how I had been prosecuted by my local council for putting my rubbish out on a Tuesday when the collection day was Tuesday. And they'd actually said in the letter, saying they were going to prosecute me. The same person had filled in Tuesday in both spaces and they still prosecuted me. And so the Sun obviously thought this was quite a funny story and decided to write it up as a news story instead. And they knew exactly who I was because the Sun and the Times are actually owned by, still are owned by the same company. And I was an assistant editor of the Times at the time. But they simply described me as Mary Ann, mum of two, They didn't say I was a journalist. They didn't say I was a senior editor. I was just mum of two. So I think that's something, I think women are more often seen like that than men. And I did wonder whether if we were writing a story about the editor of the Times, we would just have said Larry, dad of three, or whatever he was.
That is quite funny. My other half, Deirdre, she was president of Network Ireland, which is a women's networking group. And when she was president, her aim really was all about supporting women. And it was quite interesting for me as her other half, being the president's other half, being dragged along to different events and everything else. And it was really cool. It was really interesting and everything. And we're also involved in the local chambers. And it was quite really, really interesting to see the dynamic of the different organizations. At Network, everything was about supporting each other. A 100% female organization, but it's all about supporting each other. What can we do to lift the other women up? It was all about fulfilling your potential, being brave, being bold. And then if you go to Chamber, which I won't say was male dominated, but it's probably a good tilt towards the male audience, definitely. There's no sentiment in it. There's nothing really about helping the other guy up. Everyone is there to do business. It's got the kind of macho thing and, we're just swapping business cards and everything. We approach things in a different way. We're very, very different. And finding that balance and bringing more of one into the other might be a really, really good thing. It's funny, there was a particular event we went to, and it was just a networking event. It was a chamber event. Tickets were available to everybody. They were absolutely available to everybody. There was no reason why it would be one gender or the other. And yet then when you looked around the room, it was like predominantly male, and you're wondering what's going on here with the gender thing, that people aren't going to those events.
What time of day was it?
It was in the evening.
Quite. So I think you'll probably find many more women have got childcare responsibilities and can't go to networking events in the evening than men. It's just practical.
Or maybe, Marianne, they have more sense and they don't want to go to this thing and listen to boring chit-chat that has no point, and they're just a bit more clever. I'm not sure.
Oh, there may be that too. But what I think what I'm trying to say is that quite often we don't realise that we are doing something that makes life harder for women than for men, or indeed the other way around. And that's the sort of thing that would make life harder for, it would be harder for women to get to on average than men. Whereas if you had it at lunchtime, say, it might be easier.
Yeah. Where are you on the whole gender ratio conversation?
What do you mean? For things like boards?
Yeah.
I think that there are plenty of very highly qualified women who would be great on boards, but just haven't been thought of until now. I don't know how it's working in Ireland, but in the UK, the government hasn't actually put an official quota in law, but it has said that it wants big companies to have at least, I think we're up to 35 or 40% women. It started at 25 and it's gradually been growing. And what these boards have discovered is actually there are plenty of really good women that they can bring onto their boards, and it's been a big success. But they just hadn't thought of them because they were just thinking of their mates before. They were thinking, now, who do I know who I play golf with or whatever? And so just because of this classic affinity bias, where, we tend to go for people who are like ourselves, because it was on the whole men on these boards doing the hiring, they tended to go for other men. Once they were sort of forced or certainly heavily encouraged to start looking a bit further afield, they found that there are some great women too. So I'm in favor of it when it's not actually coercive, and I'm in favor of it when you get women who are just as good as the men. I wouldn't want women who are underqualified to be promoted to a board, because it's not in their interest and it's not in the board's interest or the shareholders' interest. But as long as they're good enough, I just think you end up taking much better decisions when you've got a bigger diversity of experience and views and outlook in any group, particularly a board. I was 7 years ago, I was appointed to a board which had been in existence for 125 years and hadn't had a single woman on it. And they appointed both me and another woman, for which I was very grateful, because it's never good to be the only one in a room and everyone else being a man. And so 2 of us were appointed to the board. She's fantastic, very high-flying corporate finance lawyer. She was absolutely brilliant, as expected. Can't talk for myself. But at the end of the first year, we did a board evaluation, and we were asked, what did we think had gone particularly well that year? What had gone badly? What should we be focusing on? That sort of thing. And she and I think, just talked about, all the commercial things that have gone well and badly. But when the board evaluation came back, what the men all focused on was how brilliantly she and I had managed to fit in to the board's ethos, and how surprised they were at how easy it had been. And I thought, well, that's great. I'm thrilled it's worked out so well. But why were they so surprised? What were they expecting us to be like? And I think there is this sort of sense that somehow it's a bit risky promoting a woman or hiring a woman or putting a woman on your board. And I'm saying, where's the risk? I mean, we're just as able, we're just as competent, we're just as qualified, and chances are we'll all get on very well together, which we do on this board. But there's a sense from some men, at least, that it's quite a risky proposition.
I remember feeling quite the same when I turned up for parent-teacher meetings with my kids when they were younger. And half the time, I wouldn't get to hear about the meeting. But when I did, and I'd get from some of the teachers, oh my God, you're so great to come out. You must be very interested in your child. And a bit like your reaction about the board, I was saying, what the hell? I'm these children's parent. Why am I different? Why you treat me like a second-class citizen, or surprised that I have any interest in how my children are getting on? It was a strange one.
Yeah.
When it comes to boards, I notice on your bio, you're a non-exec director of Pantheon and is it Merchant Trust?
Merchants Trust, yes. And also the Scott Trust, which owns The Guardian and The Observer.
Yeah, and in particular, the 2 financial ones. I'm thinking of the show Billions now, with all the testosterone and everything else. I think it's one particular area where that balance, in terms of the mentality and how you go about executing those roles, where it's really, really important. And we could see, in particular, how it got totally out of control in the crash of 2010 and before that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is evidence to suggest that at the margin, women are likely to take slightly fewer risks than men. It's not actually as huge as, the difference isn't as huge as you might imagine. But at the margin, women are slightly less risk-taking than men. And as a result, they actually tend to produce higher returns over the course of a financial cycle, if they're asset managers, than men do on average, because they don't take silly risks. Yeah. But I have to say, in both those boards, there is very little sort of overt testosterone or willy waving or whatever. The men are all extremely civilized and very thoughtful. And actually, on one of the boards, the fund manager is a woman, and she's completely brilliant. But on the other one, he's a man, and he's also brilliant. So I haven't had any difficulty there.
Do you think there's less willy waving because you're there?
I should imagine so, yes. Though actually the men concerned are all pretty civilized men. I don't know, by definition, I don't know how they'd behave if there weren't women in the room. But there is evidence to suggest that having more women in a group does make men behave better in general, yeah.
Do you think there's still an old boys club?
Yeah, I do. I mean, in lots of fields, there's an old boys club. I think in the city in particular, there is in finance. But I mean, what one study showed that 70% of men will rate a man more highly than a woman for achieving exactly the same goals. And that rises to 75% for men in senior positions. So they may think that they're acting objectively and that they want to choose the man over the woman because the man is better. But actually, the man isn't better than the woman. That's just what their biased brain is telling them.
And again, from my perspective, I see in so many areas and organizations, there's an old boys club. But in many cases, that includes women. That it's all about where you went to school and all that kind of thing and where you lived. And so it's an old boys club with a different frame, I guess.
Okay. I think that is true to an extent, though in Britain at least, most of the private schools are single sex. So if you're going to help someone you went to school with and you're a man, the chances are it's going to be a man. But it's also, I suspect, because Ireland's a lot smaller in terms of population and, you're much more likely to know each other, aren't you? So that probably more so than here in the UK. So that might make for even more of an old boys club. I don't know.
There's a client we're doing work for, Marianne. They're called Star Circle. And basically their proposition or the work that they do is finding talent for big companies who are really struggling to find talent at the moment. And one of the conclusions that they have is that you will find the talent, but you need to look at your rules and your parameters and scrutinize your own bias, because a lot of the time the talent is out there, but the lens you're using to look for talent is actually too narrow. And they're desperately looking for talent. They're paying whatever money they need to. They're sweating. They're hiring consultants left, right, and center. But they're discovering that if you just shift your dial a little bit, the talent is there.
That's so true. And the other thing I think that's worth looking at is the extent to which we mistake confidence for competence. And we often will hire or promote somebody who just seems more confident or self-promoting, even when they're not objectively as good. And that is much more likely to be a man for all sorts of reasons, which I go into in the book. Boys and men tend to be more confident than girls and women, and they're much more likely to overestimate their ability than girls and women are. And if we take them at their word, then we're more likely to hire or promote them and then actually regret it later because they don't turn out to be as good as maybe the more self-deprecating, quieter, less overtly confident woman was. And so if we say at an interview something like, oh, tell me the accomplishment that you're proudest of in your working life, a man is going to big himself up much more than a woman will on average, because women have been socialized to believe that it's very unfeminine and it's somehow unattractive to promote yourself. Whereas if you look at boys playing and talking together, a lot of what they do is sort of boastful competitiveness, isn't it? It's, oh, I've scored more goals this season than you have, or my dad's got a better car than you have. And that's how they bond. Girls and women do exactly the opposite. So girls bond by admitting vulnerability, which boys and men hate doing. So girls will say things like, oh, I'm useless at maths, or I hate my hair, or my bum's too big. And that's how they bond. And that's how they've been socialized to bond, both by their own peers and by their parents and teachers. Because you're always being told as a girl, oh, nobody likes a boastful girl. You can't self-promote as a girl, or indeed as a woman. And studies show that women who do self-promote are actively disliked by other people, and therefore they're much less likely to be hired or promoted. So we end up in this terrible double bind. If we don't tell hirers or managers how good we are, we're not going to get hired or promoted. But if we do, they're going to dislike us and therefore also not hire or promote us. Because actually for women, likability turns out to be a much more important factor in whether you get hired or promoted than it is for men. So all these biases come into play, which we're often not aware of. And so, we're looking for the talent, and this guy says, oh, I'm a fantastic coder. I can sort out your company's problems, in no time. And you think, oh, great, I'll hire him. And he turns out to be not nearly as good as he claimed. Whereas the woman who says, oh, well, I don't know. I think I can probably do it. I've done something similar in the past. Might turn out to be a lot better.
You've touched on a few points there. That the way society puts us all into a little box, and I know on the male side, not being as in touch with your feelings, not being able to show or share your concerns and everything. There's a lot of work we did over here for an organization called Cycle Against Suicide. And it was really to do with men in particular. No, it's not 100% men. But the core problem being men won't talk to other men. We'll go to the pub, we'll do the testosterone thing, we'll shout and roar at the TV when Liverpool are playing or the rugby is on or whatever. But a lot of the time we don't have that personal conversation. So one of the lines that we had was shoulder to shoulder. So one of their key initiatives was cycling together, Cycle Against Suicide. Because they reckon when men are in groups together, where you don't have to look at each other, you might just bring up that issue 20 miles in on a cycle with the guy who's cycling next to you and maybe share your problems in that way. So again, that kind of male-female thing and how we fight with each other. I was talking to a buddy of mine. He's the general manager in a 5-star hotel. And he was telling me that there was a terrific woman in his team and he wanted her to come up a grade. And he was really encouraging. He said, you have all the capability. And she just didn't want it. You know, and I don't know if it's a confidence thing or whatever. The guy who's only in there 3 months pulling pints behind the bar, if you asked him, did he want the job, he probably would take it. But the girl with all the capability decides just not to. Is that something on the guys or is that something on the girls?
I'd say both. Quite often with women, I prefer to call them women than girls.
That's me. I talk about boys just as easily.
Sure. That's all right. It's not a criticism. I'm just saying why I wasn't repeating you. But quite often with women, an extra layer of responsibility might require extra hours or difficult hours that are hard to combine with family. So I think if I were him, I would have investigated a bit further and said, look, what worries you about it? Is it that you're worried you can't do the job, or is it that you're worried that the job itself isn't compatible with your other responsibilities? And if so, maybe try and find a way that it could be made so. So I think make allowances for the fact that perhaps she has more caring responsibilities than the guy behind the bar pulling the pints. But if it's a question of lack of confidence, I would just do everything I could to support her and say, look, I'll be there to help. Let's give it 3 months and see how you go. You might be surprised to find that. I mean, I have belief in your abilities. I'm pretty sure you can do it. You just sometimes need to do a little bit more with a woman because her confidence is likely to have been dented a lot more than a man's. I also talk in the book about what happens in childhood in terms of other people's expectations. So I think one of the saddest pieces of research I came across was that if you ask British parents to estimate their children's IQ, they will estimate their sons on average at 115, but their daughters at only 107, despite the fact that actually boys and girls' IQs are identical. And girls, if anything, develop faster than boys, have a bigger vocabulary, do better at school than boys. But they're being brought up to believe they're somehow not as good. And boys are being brought up to believe that they're somehow better. And then that feeds through, you see, into adult life. So if you ask adult men to estimate their IQs, they on average come out at 110, and adult women at only 105. And yet women are just as clever as men.
Are you sure?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
I have to draw a line in that one, Marian. Yeah, that's kind of stupid, really.
Well, exactly.
I don't know where we can go with that kind of thinking.
But also, if I could just slightly elaborate on the confidence thing. So you might say, well, okay, let's just send women on all these assertiveness training courses and they'll be fine. Let's just boost women's confidence and they will be taken just as seriously as men. If only it were that simple. Because the trouble is, it's going back to what I was talking about with self-promoting. If women start to show as much confidence and assertiveness as men, which they have to do in order to be taken seriously, and in order to do the sort of jobs that they want to be promoted to, like running a hotel or whatever it was your friend was talking about, quite often we recoil from a woman who's like that. And we feel really uncomfortable according her that sort of authority. It makes us feel uncomfortable because she is suddenly displaying what are thought of as rather male characteristics, being confident and assertive and showing leadership and being dominant and that sort of thing. And we don't like it. And as a result, we start to use adjectives about her like, oh, she's a bit abrasive, or she's strident, or she's aggressive, or bossy, or overbearing, or even bitchy, ball breaking, stern, controlling, and these are adjectives that we wouldn't use of a man displaying confidence and assertiveness. So again, there is this real double bind for women that if you're not confident enough, no one takes you seriously and you get walked over and you're disrespected. But if you are confident enough, you're quite often disliked. And so women have to overlay a great sort of layer of warmth over their personality to be able to navigate through this very narrow path that's like a little sort of hole in the hedge, in order to be confident enough without being disliked. We have to sort of smile a lot more. We have to use humor to deflect any discomfort. We have to be terribly aware of all the male egos around us. A, it's exhausting, and B, it's a burden that men really don't have to bear. And it also just means that fewer women get through, because getting that balance right is actually really quite tricky.
So I was going to chat to you about your compound issue. And if we apply that in that scenario where my guy, the general manager, he is trying as much as he can to encourage one of his female team one of the women, not one of the girls.
Thank you.
Yeah, to step up and go for this job she's more than capable of doing. And he's picking away at her for ages, and she says, no, I can't do it for this reason. I don't believe in myself, etc. And he's busy. He needs to get it done. And he goes to the guy in the bar, are you up for doing this job? Yeah, fine. And is there a compound then where he goes, well, I'm too busy. I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to go to the next woman in the team who has potential but isn't eager. I'm just as easy now just to go with the guys. And of course, that repeats itself. So we need to break the cycle. And I think there's a bit of responsibility in all of us to do that.
Yeah, there really is. I agree. But also, he's there making that mistake of thinking that just because one woman wasn't confident enough and didn't want to do it, there's no point even asking all the others, although some of them might be absolutely dead keen to do it. And this quite often happens with women, is that if one woman fails or one woman somehow does something wrong, it is assumed that all other women will be like that. Whereas if a man fails, people just think he wasn't any good. But they don't think men must be useless because this man couldn't do it. There was a story told to me for my book. I interviewed about 40 or 50 very senior authoritative women, as well as doing all the academic research, because I wanted to see, I thought if even these really powerful women have encountered the authority gap, that is pretty good proof that it happens to all of us. And there was a great story told to me by Amber Rudd, who was a British cabinet minister in Theresa May's cabinet at the time before Theresa May was actually challenged for the leadership, but when she was in trouble over all the Brexit stuff. And Amber told me that a male fellow MP came up to her and said, "Oh, Amber, I just wanted to say, if there's a leadership contest, I'd really like to support you." And she thought, oh, great, that's another notch, another one I can count on. And then he said, "But I think we've had enough women for now." In other words, he was saying that just because one female politician turned out not to be very good at it, half the population had to be disqualified as a result.
Obama would have been under the same pressure as being the first black president.
Absolutely, yeah.
On the subject of politics and that conversation we were having earlier about Boris and Donald Trump and all of those male candidates, and I know we've got some fantastic female leaders out there, it's gone to a fairly bad place when we're supporting people with awful characters that are, very, very clearly misogynists. And there's no issue. Men and women equally were voting for them. Do you understand that now, Marianne, in 2021?
Well, actually, it was more men who were voting for Trump than women. If all the men who had voted for Obama had carried on voting Democrat and voted for Clinton, she would have won. So it wasn't women abandoning Clinton. It was actually men abandoning Clinton for Trump. But still, a lot of women did vote for Trump, and that's because their Republican allegiances were stronger than their gender allegiances. I still find it pretty weird that a woman could vote for Trump, given what he said about grabbing pussy and God knows what else. But nonetheless, that they were tribally Republican, and they couldn't bear the idea of voting Democrat. that interestingly, the second most powerful predictor of voting for Trump after party allegiance, after being a Republican, was agreeing with hostile sexism, i.e., so there are forms of sexism that are really hostile, which say things like, oh, I don't know, agreeing with statements like, oh, women will sleep with anyone to get a job, and things like that. And that was the second biggest predictor of voting for Trump, was believing these things, which is pretty depressing for women.
Yeah, I think it's pretty depressing for society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where we are at the moment, we're in a very, very bad place with all of that. The Me Too movement, Marianne, is that helping the cause of women now, or does it work against them, when it comes to the authority gap?
I think it's helped. I proposed this book, came up with the idea for it before Me Too. It's been published since, and I think the message is being more listened to because of Me Too. Because what Me Too did was give women license actually to not just to complain, but be listened to about all the shit that's happened to them in the courses of their life. From a particularly toxic type of man. Obviously, not all men go around groping their colleagues, but there is a particularly toxic type of man who does. And what Me Too did was not just allow women to make public complaints about them, but for these complaints to be taken seriously so that the men actually suffered. And then, these men lost their jobs. A few of them even ended up in jail. About bloody time, I think, because you've got no right to grab a woman between the legs. It's horrible. So I think Me Too has helped. Obviously, there's a backlash, because there's a backlash to all these things. Any movement towards greater equality or justice creates its own backlash. But I think it's moving in the right direction.
There was a particular opinion that I heard, and it wasn't just from male colleagues at the time, is that we now need to be really wary when we're dealing with female colleagues. Whether it's meetings or events away or attending an award or any of that thing. Don't be in those situations.
Well, just don't.
And I'm thinking,
just don't touch them, frankly, lecherously. Don't touch them.
Oh, no,
What you have to do, and don't invite them up to bed.
Oh, no, it was more than that, though. It was more than that. I remember it was at a specific event, and I was with a woman, a very, very high-profile woman in Ireland. And she said, this is not good. I can see it working against us because people are just very wary, ultra concerned all of a sudden. And I work with a lot of female colleagues. I would be wary, being quite honest with you. And does that work against my female colleagues? No, in a COVID world, we're not networking, we're not going to events and all that kind of thing. But I would be wary in a way that I was never before. In particular, if someone did accuse you of something.
Yeah, no, no one wants false accusations, but you seem to me to be a sensible, civilized man, as far as I can tell. And I'm sure you know the difference between just being friendly to a woman and being overtly flirtatious or touching her inappropriately.
Yeah,
so just don't do that. That's all.
Yeah. No, of course. But there are extremes, 100%. And men, maybe we're after settling into it a little bit, but I know the conversations were, we need to be really careful, even to be seen in that place. It's actually really funny. This is a terrible thing, Marianne, to even say to you. But on a particular occasion, we were interviewing, and I remember a girl came into the office, a woman, and you see, you're training me now.
Good.
This is well done.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, really, really striking woman. And I remember hearing a few comments from the gang in the office. Oh my God, who's Emma Craig? And I remember feeling under pressure that I can't even be rational with this person, because all of a sudden they're thinking, oh my God almighty, really, really pretty girl Emma Craig, is this going down like, jeekers almighty? So in that scenario, it can end up working against you, I think. And I know one of the things you covered in your book was how people comment on the female politicians versus the males, what they're wearing, someone, showing a little bit of leg or whatever, and that you'd never talk about men in that way. But when it comes to that thing, is there a natural thing that we all have, males or females? At the end of the day, we're kind of built in a particular way. And when it comes to that, do we all have natural powers and natural advantages that we end up using to our advantage, as we go about our business.
Yes. I mean, certainly. So for a man, you're going to do better in life generally if you're tall than if you're small. And you'll generally do better in life in your career if you're good looking than if you're ugly. For women, it's slightly more complicated than that. So the evidence seems to go in both directions. It's not very obvious, because if women are beautiful, quite often men will assume that they don't have brains, that it's not possible both to be beautiful and intelligent. Whereas we don't tend to think that of men, do we? You can look like Mark Carney, say, who was the governor of the Bank of England, very good looking. He sort of looked like George Clooney, and no one thought, oh, he must be dim because he's handsome. But that does happen a bit for women. On the other hand, but there's also the bias that we like to have beautiful people around us. And therefore, quite often you're more likely to hire a beautiful woman than an ugly woman, not necessarily because you think she's going to be better at the job, but just because she's eye candy. So, it's hard to disentangle. I think the ideal is to be about 7 out of 10 on looks. And then you're not going to offend the eye, but nor are you going to completely confound all the men who will just sort of turn to jelly, but also not take you seriously because you're too beautiful for that.
Do we then have a responsibility as to how we present ourselves in that way?
Responsibility? You mean how we dress?
Yeah, and I guess how we dress, it's probably makeup and lipstick and hair gel, and do I shave or do I not shave? All of those things put together.
I think people are much more critical of women's appearances than men's. So men can get away with being more sort of slovenly looking, whereas, if a woman doesn't look put together, on the whole, people will be a lot more critical. So research studies have shown that basically, grooming, as you say, makeup, nice hair, decent clothes helps for a woman, probably more than for a man. But equally, you can't be provocative. So even things like having one extra button undone or your skirt an inch shorter will affect whether people think that you're competent or not. So particularly in senior jobs, it's okay if you're a receptionist, say, but if you're a manager, you've got to be quite careful not to look provocative.
Okay. Because you are in charge. Again, it's back to marketing, isn't it? Like the cover of the book again. You are your book in so many cases. Every time you step out, you are your book. You're on the Win Happy podcast. What's happiness to you, Mary-Ann?
I think what makes me most happy is being loved. And I'm very lucky to have a very loving relationship, both with my husband and my 2 daughters. So that is the absolute bedrock of happiness. And I would be incredibly unhappy, I think, if anything went wrong with any of them or our relationship. But beyond that, I think it's really important to understand how to be content. And I think contentment helps with happiness. So I think being content with your lot in life depends a lot on who you compare yourself to. And if you are always comparing yourself with people who are more fortunate than you, who are richer or more successful, or have done better in their lives, you're always going to feel discontented and therefore unhappy with your lot. And so I think I used to say to my children, compare and despair. So I think the secret of true contentment is not to look at people who are better off than you, but actually to look at people who are worse off and think, well, I'm really lucky to have got this far, or I'm really lucky to be as well off as I am, and, not to have to worry too much about paying the utility bills at the end of the month or whatever. And therefore to take solace from the bad things that aren't happening to you, rather than wishing that more good things could happen to you. So it's really a question of which end of the telescope you use.
And when it comes to being happy, the winning idea is that, if we follow our passions, if we do things in life, we all have goals. What are your goals? I kind of give the analogy of playing a football match, and you might love playing football, but without goalposts, it might seem a bit pointless. So when you put the ball in the back of the net, it's like a big yay moment. So what are your put the ball in the back of the net moments? What's winning to you?
I think changing the world one husband at a time. So you alluded earlier to this reader who said she'd put my audiobook on in the car with her husband on a long journey. And she said, as a result, he listens now to what I say and he started asking me questions. And I'm just thinking, oh, isn't that fabulous? If I could really change the world one husband at a time, I would be a very happy woman.
That's a good scoreboard. My son has just become a father. very, very proud of him. But I can see he's allowed to be a dad, and he's allowed to be a dad in the same way that she's allowed to be a mum. It's a very, very equal thing. And I think, taking that trend, maybe that's a good thing. And maybe we'll achieve some of the things that you're trying to achieve through the book. So one last question. This is a huge one, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer it for me. Are you ready?
Yeah.
What was your best day?
Oh, God. It sounds really corny, but probably getting married, just because I love my husband so much, and it's his loving me that makes me happy. So I really, luckily, came across the right man. And that is just the bedrock of our emotions, isn't it? If we feel loved and supported and cared for and cared about, I think that enables us to go out and fight dragons and all the other things we want to do in our lives. So, yeah, it's corny, but true.
That's okay. That's allowed. Marianne, thank you so much for giving me your time and for putting up with me, wrestling with me through some of these big topics. And hopefully we can close that gap. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a real delight. I've loved it.
Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.